What's up everybody, Greg here with Lensprotogo and Lens Rentals, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be checking out the 50mm lineup from Canon, looking at the new RF lens to see how it stacks up against the other lenses that are out there. We're going to be looking at the Sigma 50mm f1.4 art lens, the 50mm f1.2L lens, which came out a few years ago, and then the 50mm f1.4 non-L lens that is the cheap version. And we're going to see how all of these compare in some optics tests as well as their physical sizes. If you want to check out some other focal lengths, we also did this on the 35mm and 85mm RF lenses, and I'll throw a link to those up here as well as in the description. So starting off with that, let's look at the 50mm RF lens. This is the largest and heaviest of the lenses that we're going to look at today, and this one comes in at 2.1 pounds with a length of 4.25 and a width of 3.5. And this lens has a filter size of 77mm. The next one down is the Sigma, which comes in pretty close to this RF lens at 1.8 pounds. It has a length of 4 inches and just under 3.25 for the width. So pretty close to that RF lens. And the Sigma's filter size is 77mm, similar to the RF. The next one down from that is the 51.2L lens, and this one comes in just over a pound at 1.3 pounds. It's got a length of just over 2.5 inches and a width of about 3.5 inches, so very similar on width to both of the Sigma and the RF lens. And the filter size on this lens is 72mm. And then lastly, we're going to look at the 51.4, which is the smallest of all of these lenses. It comes in under a pound at 10.2 ounces. It has a total height of 2 inches and just under 3 inches for the width of the barrel. And the filter size of this 51.4 is 58mm. The last thing that I like to cover before we get into the optics test is looking at the minimum focus distance for all of these lenses to see how close you can actually get to subjects and get the shot. The RF lens has a minimum focus distance of 1 foot 4 inches, and the Sigma matches that at 1 foot 4 inches. And then both of the other two lenses have a minimum focus distance of 1 foot 6 inches. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's jump into some of the optics tests. All right, so we're here in Lightroom and I have a bunch of pictures for us to go through today, and we're gonna dive right into it. So starting off with this first one, shot of my dog here, and just for continuity, I'm gonna always keep the RF lens on the left side, and then we're gonna cycle through the other three lenses over on the right, because that's really what we're comparing here to see how these other lenses stack up. So in this first shot, I really wanna take a look at the Bokeh. We have some really nice out of focus areas in the background, and a really good display of how this lens and the other lenses are gonna render that out of focus area. So starting with the RF lens, we have some really nice smooth looking bokeh. It really blends into the background. There isn't a lot of really hard edges on it, and it looks very, very pleasing and really just smooths out that background really nice. Going over to the 51.2, which is what we're comparing it against right here, we have a little bit more color on the edges. Also, they're a little bit harder, so they're a little more defined in the background. You can see a lot more of them because they don't blend in as well. Going over to the next lens, we're going to look at the Sigma Art, and this one actually looks pretty good compared to the RF lens. It's actually a little more circular. You don't have that oval shape like you see with the RF, and you don't have any color around those edges, and it blends in very nicely. So between these two, I'd probably say it's up to preference whether you like that more oval shape or if you want a circular bokeh. And then lastly, we're going to go on to the 51.4, and this one looks the worst out of all of them. You have those really hard edges. It has a lot of like clarity to it, and this one has a lot more color around the outside edges, and it doesn't blend into the background. You can also see a lot more of it and how it renders these trees rather than the smooth look like the RF. So for bokeh, I would have to say that the RF or the Sigma, depending on which one that you like better, whether you like that oval or the more circular bokeh, is going to come in first. Then it's going to be the 51.2L lens, and then lastly is this 51.4 that we just looked at. Next up, let's take a look at the chromatic aberration. Now, this isn't a beautiful shot by any means, but a really good way to check for chromatic aberrations is shooting power lines and stuff like this, because having that contrast with those thinner lines against the bright background is really going to show off any problems with that chromatic aberration and really put it through its test. And looking at the RF lens first, we have almost no chromatic aberration. It's really, really impressive what Canon has done with these lenses. I looked at the 85 as well, and there's almost zero chromatic aberration, which is really awesome. Going over to the Sigma, you can start to see a little bit of blurring on the edges, as well as that magenta shift coming in. If we punch in a little bit tighter, maybe to like a 3:1, you can see it a little bit more there with that magenta really coming through. Next up is the 51.4, and this lens I was not expecting to do well at all, and it doesn't. You can see a ton of magenta shift and basically turning the entire structure magenta because of that chromatic aberration. It's also a little bit soft. You're not getting those really nice defined lines like you are with the RF. And lastly, we're going to check out the 50mm 1.2L lens, and this one also has a ton of chromatic aberration. As you can see, as we go up to the top of the structure here, there's just tons of magenta shift. And if we look at some of these structures in the distance, you can also start to see some of that green shift on the bottom where it's very, very minimal on the RF lens. An interesting thing with this chromatic aberration is if you actually stop down your lens to about a 2.8 on any of these lenses, you're going to remove most of that chromatic aberration. So I'm going to punch in here. Again, this is the RF, which already had almost no chromatic aberration. Then we're going to go over to the Sigma, wait for it to load up here. As you can see, almost all of that chromatic aberration is gone as well. Onto the 51.4, which was the worst of all of them. And then lastly, onto the 51.2, which again, almost removes all of that chromatic aberration, being stopped down to an f2.8. So in terms of controlling this chromatic aberration, I think the RF comes in first place, the Sigma is going to come in second place, and then the 51.2L is going to be in third. And then lastly is that 51.4 because it's a little bit softer overall and that magenta really bleeds into the rest of the image. But both the 51.4 and the 1.2L are pretty bad. Next up, we're going to take a look at the exposure differences between all of these lenses. So we have them all at the exact same settings, 1/8,000th of a second, f2.8 at an ISO of 100. And we're going to see which one actually allows the most light to come through the lens. So starting off, this is the 51.2L. And if you look at the histogram over on the right side, you're going to see a little bit of an exposure shift in that histogram. So here's the 51.2L, keeping most of that exposure in that top end of the histogram. As we go to the 51.4, it drops down a little bit, but still keeps the exposure pretty bright. Next is the Sigma, and this one actually has a pretty big drop off and really a spread out of those highlight areas in that histogram. And then lastly is the RF lens, which brings it back to basically what the 51.2 was. So in terms of brightness and how much light actually is coming through these lenses, it's going to be the 51.2L, that's the most amount of light, then the RF lens, then the 51.4, and then lastly is the Sigma. Next up, we're going to take a look at flaring, starting with the RF 51.2. We're wide open at a 1.2, and you can see that there is a ton of flares in here with the sun just coming over the roof. You can see a lot of the different elements, different colors in there with the greens. There's some oranges, blues, even a little bit of rainbow in some of those flare marks. And the RF, out of all of them, definitely has the most flaring. The next one is going to be the Sigma, and this one probably has the least amount of flaring out of all of them. You just get a little bit of that blue glow, which is similar to the rest of their art line, really controlling those flares. Next up is the 51.4, and this one starts to bring a little bit of that Canon red flare back in there, and also has a couple different reflective elements in there. And then lastly is the 51.2L, and this one has a pretty minimal, pretty controlled flare as well, looking similar to the Sigma art lens, but with a couple more flaring rings around the actual light source. So if we just put all of these up here on the screen, you can see in the top left we have that RF lens. The next one on the top right is the Sigma. Bottom left is the Canon 51.4, and then the last one is the Canon 50L. And I'm not going to rate these because it really depends on what you're looking for in your flares. Next up, we're going to take a look at vignetting and how well this is controlled with these lenses. So starting with the RF lens on the left side, we can see that there's quite a bit of vignetting into those corners. We have a brighter center and then it fades off into the outer edges. And this is at a f1.2, so wide open on this lens. Over on the right side, we have the 51.2L EF lens, and it looks pretty similar. We're getting a lot of the same vignetting up into those corners, and I'd say these are pretty much the same. Going to the 51.4, wide open at a 1.4, it's very similar to the RF50 as well as the 51.2L, the older lens. And then going over to the Sigma, this is the only one that actually clears up those corners and makes it a little bit brighter and flatter across the entire image. So in terms of controlling vignetting, I think the Sigma is definitely going to come in first place. Then it's going to be a tie between the 51.2L and the 51.4. And then last place is definitely the RF lens with the most vignetting. And then the last thing that we're going to look at is the sharpness of these lenses in the center as well as into the corners. Now I took some shots using that brick wall and it was very, very close between them. So I wanted to bring it in and do it on a test chart so I could really see what the differences were between these lenses. So starting off with the 51.4 and jumping right into the center, as you can see, the RF has quite a bit more detail and resolution than the 51.4, which kind of blurs out the image a little bit. So between these two lenses, obviously the RF lens is going to win. We're going to go over to the next one, which is the 51.2L. And as you can see in the center, again, you're getting a little bit of that ghosting. It's a little clearer than the 51.4, but still wide open. It's not super sharp like the RF lens is. And then lastly is the Sigma, which actually does come pretty close to what the RF looks like. Now where this one's really gonna start to differ is out into those corners. So we go way down here. You can see that the Sigma starts to blur a little bit more on those corners than the RF lens does. Now if we go back through those, so to the 51.2, you can see that's pretty blurred, as well as the 51.4. And we're not seeing any of that even into those deep corners on the RF lens. Another important thing that can help you decide which one you're going to end up picking up is going to be the cost. Now the new RF lens definitely being the best performing optically, but also coming in with the highest price tag. It comes in at $2,300 for this mirrorless system, and because it is with the RF mount, you can't adapt this to any other lenses. Going over to the next most expensive lens, which is the 51.2L, and this comes in at $1,300. Now this is an EF lens, so if you want to adapt it to the mirrorless systems, either the EOS R or the RP, you're gonna have to get the adapter, which costs an extra $100, so that's putting this lens up to $1,400. The next one is the Sigma 51.4 art lens, and this one is just under $1,000 at $950. And again, if you need that adapter to adapt it to the EOS R or the RP, you're gonna need to spend that extra $100. And then lastly is the 51.4, which comes in at the cheapest price of $350. And again, with that adapter, it's extra $100, so $450 for the 51.4. Hopefully this video helped you out and gave you a little better idea of what the capabilities of all of these 50mm lenses are. If you want to try any of them out, there's going to be some links in the description. Also check out the other comparison that we did on the 35 and 85mm RF, doing the comparison against the Canon counterparts as well as the Sigmas. Those are going to be linked to up here as well as in the description. If you have any questions about any of these lenses, make sure to leave those in the comments. Also let me know which lens you'd pick up and why. If you want to see more videos just like this, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for new videos every single week, and I'll see you in the next one.